Claire Whitfield woke up at 3 in the morning because the other side of the bed was cold. She reached out with her hand, expecting to feel her husband's shoulder, but she found only a wrinkled sheet. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs. She sat up, her heart already beating faster than it should for someone who had just opened her eyes. Daniel Colton was not in the bathroom. He was not in the kitchen. She checked the children's rooms first, quietly, so she would not wake them. Ellie, 8 years old, was curled up with her stuffed rabbit. Noah, 6, had kicked off his blanket again. Both were fast asleep. Claire pulled Noah's blanket back over him and stepped into the hallway, her bare feet cold against the wood floor. She went downstairs. The kitchen light was off. The living room was empty. Through the window over the sink, she saw that the garage light was on, a thin yellow line under the side door. She stood there for a moment, telling herself there was nothing strange about a man checking on his tools in the middle of the night. Daniel ran his own contracting business. He kept odd hours sometimes. He had explanations for everything, and until that night, she had never once doubted him. But something about the stillness of the house, the way her own breath sounded too loud in her ears, made her walk toward the garage instead of back up the stairs. She did not open the door right away. She stood outside it and listened. She heard the sound of water running, then stopping. She heard something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. She heard her husband's voice, low, talking to no one, the way a person talks when they are trying to calm themselves down. Claire pressed her hand against the door, and for a reason she could not explain, she did not knock. She turned the handle slowly instead. The garage was dim, lit only by a single bulb hanging over the workbench. Daniel stood with his back to her, his shirt off, his shoulders tense. There was a sink in the corner that he had installed himself 2 years earlier, back when he decided he wanted a proper workspace for his projects. The water in that sink was running pink. He must have heard the door because he turned around fast, faster than she had ever seen him move. For half a second, before his face rearranged itself into something calm and familiar, Claire saw an expression she did not recognize. It was not surprise. It was not embarrassment. It was something colder, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Hey," he said, stepping in front of the sink. "You scared me. What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," Claire said, trying to keep her voice light, trying to sound like a wife curious about her husband's late-night hobby and nothing more. "Is that blood?" Daniel looked down at his hands as if he had forgotten they were there. There were dark red marks on his fingers, on his forearms. He laughed. A short, easy laugh that under any other circumstance would have put her at ease. "I cut myself on a piece of sheet metal earlier," he said. "Bled more than I expected. I didn't want you to see it and worry, so I came down to clean up." It was a good answer. It was the kind of answer that made sense, that fit neatly into the shape of the life they had built together. Claire almost believed it completely. Almost. But there was a small, stubborn voice in the back of her mind that noticed he had not shown her the cut, had not asked her to help him bandage it, had instead kept his body angled so she could not see his forearms clearly. "Let me see," she said, stepping closer. "It's fine, Claire. Go back to bed. I'll be up in a minute." She hesitated. Every instinct told her to insist, to cross the room and take his hand and look at the wound herself. But there was something in his voice, a firmness that was not quite a warning but was close to one, and she found herself backing toward the door instead. "Okay," she said, "don't stay up too late. Ellie has her recital in the morning." "I know," he said, and smiled at her, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the man she had married 9 years earlier, the man who had proposed to her on a beach at sunset, the man who coached Noah's soccer team on Saturdays and always remembered to bring orange slices for the other kids, the man who had never once raised his voice at her in 9 years of marriage. She went back upstairs, but she did not sleep. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of the garage door eventually closing, to Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, to the bathroom sink running for what felt like 10 full minutes. When he finally slid into bed beside her, smelling of soap and something else underneath it, something metallic that the soap had not quite washed away, she pretended to be asleep. The next morning was ordinary in every way that mattered. Ellie's recital went perfectly, and she played her small violin piece without a single mistake, and Daniel filmed the whole thing on his phone, beaming with pride, telling every other parent in the audience how talented his daughter was. Noah ran around the reception afterward with 2 other boys from his class, and Claire stood by the refreshment table making small talk with the other mothers, and if anyone had looked at her family that day, they would have seen nothing but warmth. But Claire could not stop thinking about the sink, about the color of the water, about the look on Daniel's face before he knew she was there. That evening, after the children were in bed, she found herself standing at the door to the garage again. It was locked this time. Daniel always kept a spare key on a hook by the back door, but when she checked, the hook was empty. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Married people did not spy on each other. Trust was the foundation of everything they had built. She had known Daniel since college, had watched him grow from an ambitious young man with a used truck and a dream of starting his own business into a respected contractor whose name was on half the new homes in their town. Everyone loved him. Everyone said Claire was lucky. She almost convinced herself to let it go. Almost. Then, 3 days later, she was folding laundry and found a receipt in the pocket of Daniel's jeans. It was from a gas station in Millbrook, a town nearly 2 hours away, dated the night of the garage incident. Daniel had told her he was working late on a renovation project across town that night, a project she knew for a fact was only 15 minutes from their house. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, holding the small piece of paper, feeling the shape of her life begin to shift beneath her, like a floor she had always trusted, suddenly revealing a crack. She did not confront him immediately. Instead, she began to watch. She noticed things she had somehow never noticed before, small details that had always been there, waiting to be seen. The way Daniel sometimes flinched when the local news came on. The way he changed the channel quickly if a story mentioned a missing person or an unsolved case in the county. The way he had started locking the workshop cabinet where he kept his tools, something he had never done before, not even when the children were small and might have wandered in. She thought about the missing woman from 2 towns over, a nurse named Diane Coleman who had vanished 8 months earlier after her night shift at the hospital. It had been all over the news for weeks. Claire remembered watching the coverage with Daniel on the couch, remembered him getting up abruptly halfway through one broadcast and saying he needed some air. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. People got uncomfortable watching stories about missing women, especially men who loved their wives and daughters, and did not like to imagine such things happening to people they cared about. That was what she had told herself. Now she was not so sure. Claire began to keep a small notebook, hidden in the lining of her jewelry box, where she wrote down dates and times and small observations. She hated herself a little for doing it. It felt like a betrayal, like she was accusing her husband of something unspeakable, simply for coming home late, or reacting strangely to a news story. She told herself she was probably wrong. She told herself there would be a simple explanation, the way there always had been before. But the notebook kept filling up. There was the night he came home with a scratch across his cheek, claiming he had walked into a low branch while checking on a client's property. There was the time she found a second phone charging in his truck, a phone she had never seen before, that disappeared from the console the very next day when she went looking for it again. There was the way their neighbor, Grace Bennett, an older woman who had lived on their street for 30 years, had started avoiding eye contact with Daniel, crossing to the other side of the road when she saw him coming. Claire tried to talk to Grace about it, casually, over the fence one afternoon while both women were tending their gardens. "Is everything all right between you and Daniel?" Claire asked, keeping her tone light. "I feel like you've been a little distant lately." Grace's hands paused over her flower bed. She glanced toward the Colton house, then back at Claire, and for a moment, something like worry passed over her weathered face. "It's nothing, dear," Grace said. "I've just had a lot on my mind." "Grace." The older woman sighed and straightened up, brushing dirt from her gloves. "I saw him one night, a few months back, driving out of the neighborhood very late. Must have been past midnight. He didn't have his headlights on until he reached the main road. I probably shouldn't have thought anything of it, but it struck me as odd at the time." Claire felt her stomach tighten. "Do you remember which night?" Grace thought for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "I couldn't say for certain. I'm sorry, Claire. I don't mean to alarm you. I'm sure there's a perfectly good reason." But Claire noticed that Grace did not sound sure at all. That night, Claire lay awake next to her husband, studying the familiar shape of his face in the dim light from the hallway, trying to reconcile the man she had loved for 9 years with the shadow of doubt that had settled over her heart. He looked so peaceful when he slept. He always had. It was one of the things she used to love most about him, how easily he could let go of the day's stress and rest. Now she wondered what he was resting from. She thought about the children down the hall, about Ellie's violin recital and Noah's soccer games, about the life they had built together in this house with its white picket fence and its garden full of Grace Bennett's advice on roses. She thought about how quickly a life could look different once you started asking the right questions. Claire did not sleep much that night. Instead, she made a decision. She would find out the truth, one way or another, no matter how much it frightened her. She owed it to herself. She owed it to her children. And if her worst fears turned out to be nothing more than shadows and coincidence, she would apologize to Daniel for ever doubting him, and never speak of it again. But if they turned out to be true, she needed to know before it was too late. The next morning, she waited until Daniel left for work, kissed the children goodbye at the bus stop, and returned to the empty house with a plan already forming in her mind. She was going to find that spare garage key. She was going to look inside that locked cabinet. And she was not going to stop until she understood exactly what her husband had been hiding from her, and for how long. She stood at the back door for a long moment, key hook empty in front of her, and felt something harden inside her chest, something that had not been there before. It was not quite courage, it was closer to necessity, the feeling of a person who has realized there is no going back to not knowing. Whatever waited for her behind that locked door, she was going to find it. Claire found the spare key 3 days later, tucked inside an old coffee tin on the top shelf of the garage, hidden behind a row of paint cans that had not been touched in years. Her hands were shaking as she pulled it free. She had waited for a morning when Daniel had an early site visit scheduled, one that would keep him away for at least 3 hours, and she had sent the children off to school with a rushed goodbye, barely able to focus on their small voices telling her about their day ahead. Now she stood alone in the garage, the coffee tin cold in her palm, staring at the locked cabinet against the far wall. It was an ordinary metal cabinet, the kind sold at any hardware store, the kind Daniel had bought 2 years earlier, when he said he wanted somewhere secure to keep his more expensive tools. She had never questioned it then. Contractors kept valuable equipment. It made sense. It made less sense now that a simple padlock had appeared on its door only in the last few months, right around the time everything had started to feel wrong. The key from the coffee tin did not fit the padlock. Claire stood there for a long moment, disappointed, but somehow not surprised. Of course it would not be that easy. She searched the garage more carefully, running her hands along the tops of shelves, checking the pockets of an old work jacket hanging by the door, looking inside a toolbox that held nothing but ordinary wrenches and screwdrivers. She found a second key taped to the underside of the workbench, wrapped in a strip of black electrical tape that made it nearly invisible unless a person was looking for it specifically. Claire's fingers trembled as she peeled the tape away. This key was smaller, newer, its metal still bright and unscratched. It fit the padlock perfectly. For a moment, Claire simply stood there with her hand on the lock, unwilling to turn it. Once she opened this cabinet, there would be no pretending anymore, no telling herself that she was imagining things, or reading too much into small coincidences. Whatever was inside would either put her mind at ease or confirm every fear that had been growing in her chest for weeks. She thought of Ellie's small, careful violin fingers. She thought of Noah's laugh when he scored a goal. She thought of 9 years of shared mornings and quiet nights, and a marriage she had believed, until very recently, was as solid as the ground beneath her feet. She turned the key. The cabinet held 3 shelves. The top shelf was exactly what she expected. Ordinary tools, arranged in neat rows, the kind of thing that would have made this entire search feel foolish if it had ended there. The middle shelf held a stack of folders, business paperwork, invoices, receipts for supplies. Claire flipped through them quickly, her heart still hammering, finding nothing more sinister than an accountant would find suspicious. It was the bottom shelf that made her breath catch. There was a small wooden box, the kind used to store jewelry or keepsakes, pushed toward the back where it would not be immediately visible. Claire pulled it out and lifted the lid, and inside she found a collection of items that made no sense together, that had no obvious connection to her husband's contracting business, or to anything in their shared life. A silver bracelet, delicate, and clearly a woman's, engraved on the inside with initials that were not Claire's. A hospital identification badge with a photograph of a smiling woman with dark hair, the name Diane Coleman, printed clearly beneath her picture. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a printed map, with a location circled in red pen, somewhere out past the edge of town, near the old quarry that had been closed for as long as Claire had lived in the area. Claire sat down hard on the concrete floor, the wooden box in her lap, and stared at the identification badge, until the smiling face of Diane Coleman blurred through her tears. She remembered the news coverage from 8 months earlier. She remembered Daniel getting up abruptly from the couch. She remembered every strange night, every unexplained scratch, every flinch at the mention of a missing woman. She was no longer confused about what was happening in her marriage. She was terrified. Her first instinct was to call the police immediately, to run from the garage with the wooden box clutched against her chest and never look back. But a colder, more careful part of her mind took over instead, the part that understood she needed to think clearly if she was going to protect her children. If she called the police now, with nothing but a box of items and her own suspicions, would they believe her? Daniel was well liked in the community. He had built half the houses on their street. People trusted him in a way that made Claire's accusations sound, even to her own ears, like the paranoid fantasy of a wife who had let her imagination run away from her. She needed more than suspicion. She needed something undeniable. Claire photographed everything in the box with her phone, her hands still shaking, careful to capture every angle of the bracelet, the badge, the map with its red circle. Then she placed each item back exactly where she had found it, closed the wooden box, returned it to the bottom shelf, and locked the cabinet again, taping the small key back into its hiding place beneath the workbench. She walked back into the house on legs that did not feel entirely her own, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, trying to understand how the last 9 years of her life could have existed alongside something so dark, without her ever noticing. She thought about all the small moments she had dismissed. The way Daniel sometimes disappeared for hours without explanation, always with a reasonable excuse ready when he returned. The way he had insisted on installing extra locks on the garage 2 years earlier, saying he was worried about theft in the neighborhood, though nothing had ever actually been stolen. The way he sometimes seemed to watch the news with a strange, focused intensity, as if he were checking for something, rather than simply staying informed. Had there been others before Diane Coleman? Claire did not want to think about the possibility, but once the thought entered her mind, she could not push it away. She began, almost against her will, to think back through the years of their marriage, searching for other unexplained absences, other unsolved stories from the local news that might connect to nights when Daniel had come home late with a ready excuse and a strange energy underneath his calm exterior. She remembered a woman named Patricia Vance who had gone missing 4 years earlier from a town about an hour north, a case that had made the local papers for a few weeks before fading from public attention when no answers were found. Claire had not thought about that case in years. Now she found herself wondering, with a sickness rising in her stomach, whether Daniel had been away on a job that week, whether there had been a scratch or a strange smell, or some other small detail she had simply not thought to notice at the time, because she had never had a reason to look for one. She needed evidence, real evidence, something that would hold up if she brought it to the police. She thought about the map with its red circle near the old quarry. If Daniel had truly done something terrible to Diane Coleman, there was a chance that place held answers, a chance that whatever the police had failed to find in 8 months of searching might still be there, waiting. But going there herself was dangerous, and Claire knew it. She was not foolish enough to drive out to a remote quarry alone, based on a hunch and a red circle on a printed map. If her suspicions were correct, then the man she had married, the father of her children, was capable of violence beyond anything she had ever imagined, and she could not risk putting herself in a position where she might become the next name on a missing persons list. She decided instead to gather more information first, carefully, quietly, without ever letting Daniel suspect that anything had changed. She would need to learn more about Diane Coleman's case, about the timeline of her disappearance, about anything the police had released to the public that might connect to what Claire now knew was hidden in that wooden box. That evening, Daniel came home in good spirits, talking about a new project he had just been hired for, a large renovation on the other side of town that would keep his crew busy for the next several months. He kissed Claire on the cheek in the kitchen while she stirred a pot of soup on the stove, and she felt her whole body go rigid at his touch. Though she forced herself to smile and ask him about his day, as if nothing had changed. "You seem tired," Daniel said, studying her face across the kitchen island. "Everything okay?" "Just a long day," Claire said, keeping her voice steady, even as her mind screamed at her to run, to grab the children and leave the house immediately, and never look back. Ellie had a rough time with her homework, and Noah wouldn't stop asking when you'd be home to watch the game with him. It was a lie, a small and easy one, the kind of thing she said dozens of times a week without thinking. Tonight it felt different, felt heavier, felt like the first thread in a web of deception she would now have to weave carefully around her husband if she wanted to protect her family and uncover the truth at the same time. Daniel smiled and went to find Noah, and Claire watched him walk away, watched the easy, confident stride of a man who had no idea his wife had just discovered something that could destroy everything he had built. She wondered, watching him kneel down beside their son on the living room floor, how many other people had once trusted that same warm smile before something terrible happened to them. Later that night, after the children were asleep and Daniel had gone to bed early, exhausted from his new project, Claire sat alone in the living room with her laptop, the blue light of the screen, the only illumination in the dark house. She began searching for everything she could find about Diane Coleman's disappearance, scrolling through old news articles, watching archived television reports, taking careful notes in the same hidden notebook where she had recorded Daniel's strange behavior over the past weeks. The more she read, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way that made her stomach turn. Diane Coleman had finished her night shift at the hospital and had never made it home. Her car had been found abandoned near a gas station on the outskirts of town. The same town, Claire now remembered with a chill, where she had found the receipt in Daniel's jeans pocket. The police had no leads, no suspects, no explanation for how a woman could simply vanish on her drive home from work. Except now Claire had a wooden box hidden in her garage that suggested otherwise. She closed her laptop sometime after midnight, her eyes burning with exhaustion, her mind racing with possibilities she did not want to consider but could no longer ignore. She thought about calling her sister, Laura, who lived 2 states away, and had always been the person Claire turned to in moments of crisis. She thought about confiding in her closest friend, Olivia, who lived just a few streets over, and had known Daniel almost as long as Claire had. But she was afraid. Afraid that if word got back to Daniel somehow, if he sensed that his secret had been discovered, there was no telling what he might do to protect himself, and Claire could not shake the growing certainty that whatever gentleness she had once seen in her husband's eyes had always been sitting alongside something far darker, patiently waiting, hidden just beneath the surface of the life they had built together. She climbed the stairs quietly and slipped into bed beside him, lying awake in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how many more nights she would have to pretend everything was normal before she found a way to bring the truth into the light, without putting herself or her children in the path of whatever violence lived inside the man sleeping peacefully next to her. Claire understood that she could not keep searching for answers alone, hiding in the dark with her laptop and her secret notebook, forever pretending to Daniel that nothing had changed. She needed help, but she needed to be careful about who she trusted with something this dangerous. After several days of turning the problem over in her mind, she decided to reach out to her sister, Laura, who lived 2 states away and worked as a paralegal at a law firm in the city. Laura had a sharp mind and a habit of thinking through problems calmly, without letting emotion cloud her judgment, and Claire desperately needed that kind of steady presence right now. She called Laura on a Tuesday afternoon, while the children were still at school, and Daniel was on a job site across town. She kept her voice low even though there was no one else in the house to overhear her, as if the walls themselves might carry her words back to her husband. "Something is wrong with Daniel," Claire said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I found something in the garage. Laura, I think he might be connected to that missing nurse, the one from the news a few months ago." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Laura finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone trying not to panic, even as the words she was hearing were deeply alarming. "Tell me everything," Laura said, "from the beginning." Claire told her about the night in the garage, the pink water in the sink, the receipt from Millbrook, the locked cabinet, and the wooden box hidden inside it. She described the silver bracelet, the hospital identification badge, the map with its red circle near the old quarry. She told her sister about Grace Bennett's story, of Daniel driving away at midnight without his headlights on, about the way he flinched at news stories, about the second phone that had disappeared from his truck the moment she noticed it. By the time she finished, she was crying quietly at the kitchen table, and Laura's voice on the other end of the line had lost all its careful calm. "You need to get out of that house," Laura said. "Tonight. Take the kids and come stay with me. This is too dangerous, Claire. If even half of what you're describing is true, you cannot stay under the same roof as that man." "I can't just leave," Claire said. "What if I'm wrong? What if there's some explanation I haven't thought of? Daniel has never once hurt me or the children. Not once, in 9 years. What if I destroy our entire family over a misunderstanding?" "And what if you're right?" Laura shot back. "What if you wait too long, trying to be fair to him, and something happens to you, or the kids, because you gave him the benefit of the doubt? Claire, listen to yourself. A hospital badge belonging to a missing woman. A bracelet that isn't yours. A map with a location circled near an old quarry. Those aren't things that have an innocent explanation." Claire knew her sister was right, but the fear of being wrong, of tearing apart her children's lives, and her own reputation in the community over a mistake, held her back from acting as quickly as Laura wanted her to. She promised to think carefully about her next steps, and to call Laura again in a few days with an update. That night, unable to sleep, Claire found herself thinking about the old quarry marked on the map. She knew she should not go there alone, knew it went against every piece of advice her sister had just given her, but something about the uncertainty was unbearable. She needed to know if there was truth behind that red circle, before she could bring herself to destroy her family based on suspicion alone. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, when Daniel had taken the children to a soccer tournament 2 towns over, Claire told him she was feeling unwell and would stay home to rest. As soon as his truck disappeared down the street, she got into her own car and drove toward the coordinates she had memorized from the map in the wooden box. The old quarry sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dense trees that blocked most of the daylight, even at mid-morning. Claire parked her car a short distance away, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, and walked the rest of the way on foot, her heart pounding with every step. The quarry itself was a massive scar in the earth, its walls steep and gray. A small pool of dark water collected at the bottom where rainwater had gathered over the years since the mining operation shut down. She did not know what she expected to find. Some part of her had imagined dramatic, undeniable evidence, something that would settle the question once and for all. Instead, she found only silence and stone and the eerie feeling of standing somewhere that had witnessed something terrible, though she could not have said how she knew that. Near the edge of the quarry, half hidden beneath a fallen branch, she noticed a patch of disturbed earth, different in color and texture from the ground around it, as if it had been dug up and refilled at some point in the recent past. Claire knelt down and, with trembling hands, began to clear away the loose soil, uncertain what she was even looking for, driven by a need to understand that had overtaken her fear. Her fingers found fabric first, a scrap of pale blue material that might have once been part of a hospital uniform. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had found enough. She did not need to dig further to know, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that something terrible had happened at this quarry, and that her husband was connected to it. Claire covered the disturbed earth as best she could, trying to leave it looking undisturbed, and hurried back to her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. She drove home in a daze, her mind replaying every peaceful family dinner, every bedtime story Daniel had read to their children, every ordinary moment of their shared life, all of it now cast in a horrifying new light. She called Laura again that evening, once the children were asleep and Daniel was in the shower, describing what she had found at the quarry in a whisper, her voice breaking with fear and grief for the life she had believed she was living. "You have to go to the police," Laura said. "Now, Claire, tonight, if you can. This isn't something you can sit on any longer." "I'm scared," Claire admitted. "If I go to the police, and it gets back to him before they're ready to act, what happens to me? What happens to Ellie and Noah?" Laura was quiet for a moment, and Claire could hear her sister thinking, weighing the danger against the necessity of action. "Then we do this carefully," Laura finally said. "Tomorrow, take the kids somewhere. Anywhere. A friend's house, a hotel, anywhere away from that house. Once you're safe, we call the police together, and you tell them everything. But you cannot spend another night under that roof pretending everything is normal. Not now that you know what you know. Claire agreed, though even as she hung up the phone, a part of her still resisted the idea, still clung to some faint, desperate hope that there was an explanation she had not considered, that the man sleeping down the hall was still the same person she had married 9 years earlier, and not a stranger capable of unspeakable violence. She barely slept that night, lying awake beside Daniel, studying the rise and fall of his chest, wondering how she had shared a bed with this man for nearly a decade, without ever sensing the darkness apparently living just beneath his calm surface. When morning finally came, she moved through her usual routine, with a kind of hollow, mechanical calm, making breakfast for the children, packing their lunches, kissing Daniel goodbye as he left for work, all while her mind screamed at her to run. As soon as his truck turned the corner, Claire began packing a bag for herself and the children, telling Ellie and Noah they were going to visit their Aunt Laura for a surprise trip, an explanation they accepted with the easy excitement of young children who had no idea their entire world was quietly cracking apart behind them. She was loading the last of their bags into the car when her phone rang. It was Daniel. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, warm, exactly the way it always sounded. "I forgot my tool bag in the garage. Can you grab it and drop it by the site? I'm slammed today, and I really need it." Claire's heart seized in her chest. She glanced at the children, already buckled into the back seat, their small faces turned toward her with innocent expectation, and forced her voice to remain steady. "Sure," she said. "I'll swing by in a bit." She hung up the phone and stood in the driveway for a long moment, torn between the urgent need to get her children away from this house and the fear that refusing Daniel's simple request might somehow tip him off that something had changed. In the end, she decided the safest path was to appear as normal as possible for just a little while longer, to deliver the tool bag as though nothing were wrong, and then to drive straight to her sister's house without ever returning home again. She retrieved the bag from the garage, careful not to glance toward the locked cabinet, careful to keep her hands from shaking as she carried it out to the car. As she drove toward Daniel's job site, her children chattering happily in the back seat about the surprise visit to their aunt, Claire felt as though she were living inside two entirely separate realities at once, one bright and ordinary, the other dark and full of dread, and she did not know how much longer she could hold both of them together without breaking apart completely. The job site was a large property on the edge of town, a house under renovation with scaffolding along one side, and a row of trucks parked in the gravel driveway. Claire pulled in slowly, scanning the area for Daniel, trying to keep her expression pleasant and unremarkable, while her pulse hammered beneath her calm exterior. She spotted him near the front porch, talking with two members of his crew, gesturing toward the roofline with the easy confidence of a man completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. She parked the car and got out, leaving the children buckled inside with the windows cracked, and carried the tool bag toward him. Daniel looked up and smiled when he saw her, jogging over to meet her halfway across the gravel. "You're a lifesaver," he said, taking the bag from her hands. "I would have been useless without this." "No problem," Claire said, forcing a smile onto her face that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Daniel glanced past her toward the car, noticing the suitcases visible through the rear window, the children's small faces pressed against the glass, waving at him. His smile faltered, just slightly, just enough for Claire to notice. "Going somewhere?" he asked. "Laura invited us for a few days," Claire said, keeping her voice light. "Surprise trip for the kids. I mentioned it to you last week, remember?" She had not mentioned it last week. She had not mentioned it at all, until that morning, and she watched Daniel's face carefully, searching for any sign that he suspected the lie. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something sharp and assessing that made her stomach drop, but then it was gone, replaced by his usual easy warmth. Right, he said. "Sounds fun. Tell Laura I said hello. Drive safe." He leaned in to kiss her cheek, and Claire had to fight the instinct to flinch away from him, to keep her body from betraying the fear that had settled into every part of her since she had knelt beside that disturbed patch of earth at the old quarry. She managed to accept the kiss, to smile, to wave to his crew as she walked back toward the car, and it was only once she was buckled into the driver's seat, pulling out of the gravel driveway, that she allowed herself to breathe again. She kept checking her mirrors the entire drive to the highway, half expecting to see Daniel's truck following behind her, though logically she knew he could not have left the job site that quickly. Still, the fear did not loosen its grip on her chest until she was well outside the county, the children asleep in the back seat, the familiar landmarks of her hometown finally disappearing behind her. Laura lived in a small but comfortable house on a quiet street in the city, and she was waiting on the front porch when Claire finally pulled into the driveway that evening, exhausted from the drive and from the emotional weight of everything that had happened over the past several weeks. Laura hugged her tightly the moment she stepped out of the car, and for the first time since she had walked into that garage 3 weeks earlier, Claire allowed herself to cry openly, safe in her sister's arms, while Ellie and Noah looked on with confused concern. "You're safe now," Laura said, holding her close. "You did the right thing." That night, after the children were settled into the guest room and finally asleep, exhausted from the long drive, Claire and Laura sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea neither of them drank, going over everything one more time. Laura had already reached out to a contact she knew from her work at the law firm, a retired detective named Martin Hale, who now did private investigative work and had experience handling cases that involved dangerous or influential individuals. Martin arrived the next morning, a tall, quiet man in his 60s with sharp eyes and an unhurried way of speaking that immediately put Claire at ease, despite the gravity of their conversation. She told him everything, from the night in the garage, to the wooden box in the locked cabinet, to the scrap of blue fabric she had found buried at the old quarry. She showed him the photographs on her phone, the notebook full of dates and observations she had kept hidden for weeks. Martin listened without interrupting, taking notes of his own, his expression giving nothing away until she had finished speaking. "This is serious," he said finally. "What you found at that quarry, if it's what you believe it is, this isn't something we can handle quietly between us. This needs to go to the police, and it needs to happen soon, before your husband has any reason to suspect that you know what you know." "I'm afraid," Claire admitted. "Afraid of what happens if the police can't move fast enough. Afraid of what he might do if he finds out before they're ready." "That's a reasonable fear," Martin said, "which is why we're going to be careful about how we do this. I have a contact in the county sheriff's department, a detective I trust. I'll reach out to her today and explain the situation. In the meantime, you and the children stay here, away from him, and you do not answer any calls from your husband that might tip him off that anything has changed." Claire nodded, grateful for someone with experience and a clear head to guide her through what felt like an impossible situation. Over the following 2 days, Martin worked closely with a detective named Renee Osei from the sheriff's department, coordinating the careful process of building a case strong enough to act on. Claire provided every photograph, every note from her hidden notebook, every detail she could remember about Daniel's strange behavior over the past several months. Detective Osei explained that the sheriff's department had, in fact, been quietly investigating a series of unsolved disappearances in the region for over a year. Cases that had never been publicly connected to one another, but that shared certain similarities the department had been reluctant to release to the media. Diane Coleman's case was the most recent, but there had been at least 2 others over the past several years, women who had vanished without explanation, their cases growing cold despite the department's best efforts. "We've had a few threads to pull on," Detective Osei told Claire during a careful, quiet meeting at Laura's kitchen table, "but nothing solid enough to bring charges against anyone. What you found could be exactly what we need to finally move forward. Once we act on this, once we bring him in for questioning, or execute a search warrant on your property, there's no going back. Your life, your children's lives, everything is going to change, regardless of how this turns out." "I understand," Claire said, and she meant it, though the weight of those words settled heavily on her shoulders as she said them. She thought about Ellie's violin recitals and Noah's soccer games, about the family photographs on the walls of their home, about 9 years of a life she had believed was real and good, all of it now hanging in the balance, waiting to be either confirmed as a nightmare or, by some miracle she no longer believed in, revealed as an enormous misunderstanding. But she had seen the wooden box. She had knelt beside that disturbed earth at the quarry and touched the scrap of blue fabric buried beneath it. There was no misunderstanding large enough to explain those things away, and some part of her had already accepted, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep would not come, that the man she had married was not who she had believed him to be. Detective Osei spent the following day obtaining a search warrant for the Colton property, working carefully and quietly to avoid any leak that might reach Daniel before they were ready to act. Claire remained at Laura's house with the children, trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine for their sake, helping Ellie with a school project and taking Noah to a nearby park, all while her mind remained fixed on the operation unfolding back in her hometown. Daniel called her twice that day, his voice growing increasingly concerned each time, asking when she and the children planned to return, mentioning that he missed them, that the house felt too quiet without them. Claire forced herself to answer with warmth she did not feel, telling him they were having a wonderful time with Laura and would be home in a few more days, buying the time that Detective Osei and her team needed to prepare their case. By the second night, Claire found it almost unbearable to continue the performance, to speak to Daniel as though nothing had changed, knowing that within days, possibly hours, everything he had built, every lie he had told her for years, was about to come crashing down around him. She kept thinking about Diane Coleman's smiling photograph on that hospital badge, about the family that woman must have left behind, about how close Claire herself might have come to becoming another name added to that same terrible list, another wife or mother who simply vanished one day and was never seen again. She did not sleep well that night, or the night after, haunted by dreams of the quarry, of pink water running down a drain, of Daniel's face turning toward her in the dim garage light, with an expression she still could not fully name. But beneath the fear, something else had begun to grow inside her, something steadier and more determined. She was no longer simply hiding, no longer simply trying to survive one day at a time. She was ready to help end this, whatever it cost her, and whatever remained of the life she had once believed was hers. On the third day, everything began to unravel faster than anyone had anticipated. Claire was in Laura's kitchen, helping Noah build a puzzle at the table while Ellie watched cartoons in the next room, when her phone rang, with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. It was Grace Bennett, her voice tight with worry. "Claire, dear, I don't want to alarm you, but I think you should know. Daniel came by your house yesterday evening, quite late, and he was going through the garage for a long time, longer than usual, and this morning, he was standing in your driveway, just staring at your house, like he was trying to figure something out." Claire's blood ran cold. "Did he see you watching him?" "I don't believe so," Grace said. "But Claire, he looked different, agitated, not like himself at all. I thought you should know, in case it means anything." Claire thanked her and hung up the phone, her hands trembling as she processed what this meant. If Daniel had gone into the garage and discovered that the wooden box had been disturbed, even slightly out of place from how he remembered leaving it, he would know that someone had found his secret. And if he suspected Claire specifically, there was no telling what he might do, not just to protect himself, but to protect his freedom. She called Detective Osei immediately, relaying what Grace had told her, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "We need to move faster," Detective Osei said, her tone shifting into something more urgent than Claire had heard from her before. "I was hoping to have another day to build out the case properly, but if he's growing suspicious, we can't afford to wait. I'm going to push to execute the search warrant tomorrow morning. In the meantime, Claire, I need you to promise me something. Do not, under any circumstances, go back to that house alone. Do not answer any calls from him that ask you to meet him anywhere. If he shows up at your sister's house, call us immediately and do not open the door." Claire promised, though the fear settling into her chest made even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. She spent the rest of that day watching the windows of Laura's house, jumping at every car that passed on the street outside, unable to focus on anything beyond the growing certainty that the calm, careful life she had once known was now completely and permanently gone. That evening, as she was helping the children get ready for bed, her phone rang again. It was Daniel. She almost did not answer, remembering Detective Osei's warning, but some instinct told her that ignoring the call entirely might raise more suspicion than answering it carefully would. She stepped into the hallway, out of earshot of the children, and picked up. "Hey," Daniel said, and immediately Claire could hear something different in his voice, a tension underneath the casual tone that had not been there in his previous calls. "When are you coming home? It's been almost a week. I miss you guys." "Soon," Claire said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Laura's been asking us to stay a bit longer. The kids are having a great time." "I went by the garage yesterday," Daniel said, and Claire's heart stopped, looking for something. Noticed a few things seemed out of place. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? The question hung in the air between them, and Claire understood, with a chilling clarity, that this was the moment everything could fall apart. She thought quickly, forcing herself to keep her voice light and unbothered. I haven't been in the garage in weeks, Daniel. Maybe one of your crew members borrowed something and put it back wrong. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Claire began to wonder if the call had dropped. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, the warmth gone, replaced by something flat and careful. Right, he said, probably that. Listen, I have to go. Give the kids a hug for me. He hung up before Claire could respond, and she stood in the hallway for a long moment, her phone still pressed to her ear, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted once again. She called Detective Osei immediately and relayed the conversation, her voice shaking so badly that she had to repeat herself twice before the detective understood everything she was saying. He knows, Detective Osei said grimly. Or at least he suspects. Claire, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're moving up the timeline. I'm getting a team together tonight, and we'll execute the search warrant first thing in the morning, before he has a chance to destroy anything, or do something we can't undo. In the meantime, I want a patrol car stationed near your sister's house tonight, just as a precaution. Can you give me the address? Claire provided the address, her hands shaking so badly she had to read it off Laura's mail to be sure she got it right. After she hung up, she went to check on the children, finding Ellie already asleep and Noah still awake, quietly reading a book by the light of his bedside lamp. Is everything okay, Mom? Noah asked, looking up at her with the perceptive concern that 6-year-olds sometimes possessed, despite their young age. You seem worried. Everything is going to be okay, sweetheart, Claire said, sitting on the edge of his bed and smoothing his hair back from his forehead. I promise. Get some sleep now. She stayed with him until his eyes finally closed, then went to find Laura, who was waiting in the living room with 2 cups of tea and an expression of fierce, protective determination. A patrol car is coming, Claire told her. Detective Osei thinks Daniel might already suspect something. Laura nodded, setting down her tea and crossing the room to check that the front door was locked, then the back door, then each of the windows on the ground floor, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided that worry alone was not going to keep her family safe. The patrol car arrived within the hour, parking discreetly at the end of the street, where it could watch the house without drawing unnecessary attention. Claire and Laura sat up together long into the night, unable to sleep, jumping at every unfamiliar sound, watching the street outside the front window for any sign of Daniel's truck. Around 2 in the morning, headlights swept across the front of the house, and both women froze, watching as a vehicle slowed near the driveway, before continuing past, disappearing down the street. Claire's heart pounded so hard, she could feel it in her throat, and it took several minutes before she could convince herself to breathe normally again. It was not Daniel's truck, a neighbor returning home late, nothing more. But the false alarm left both sisters shaken, aware of just how close they might be to a confrontation neither of them felt prepared to face. Claire finally fell into a restless sleep sometime before dawn, curled up on Laura's couch with a blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, and when she woke a few hours later, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and her phone was buzzing with a call from Detective Osei. We're executing the search warrant now, the detective said, her voice tight with focus. I wanted you to hear it from me, before you saw anything on the news. We have a team at the property. I'll call you the moment we know more. Claire sat up on the couch, her heart pounding, and waited, the minutes stretching out with unbearable slowness, knowing that somewhere across town, the truth about her husband, about her marriage, about the family she had spent 9 years building, was finally about to come into the light, whether she was ready for it or not. The call came just after 10 in the morning, and Claire answered it before the first ring had even finished, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Claire, it's Detective Osei. I need you to stay calm and listen to me. Did you find him? Is he there? He wasn't at the house when we arrived, the detective said, and Claire felt her stomach drop. It looks like he left sometime late last night, or very early this morning. His truck is gone. But Claire, we found the cabinet in the garage, exactly where you described it. The wooden box was there. Everything you told us matches what we found. Claire sank onto the edge of Laura's couch, relief and terror colliding inside her chest, in a way that left her feeling almost dizzy. So you believe me now? We believed you before, Detective Osei said gently. This confirms it beyond any doubt. We've also recovered items connecting him to at least 2 of the other unsolved cases we've been investigating. This is enough to move forward with an arrest warrant, but right now, our biggest concern is finding him before he does something that puts himself, or someone else, in greater danger. Claire's mind raced immediately to her children, asleep down the hall, unaware that their father was now the subject of a manhunt spanning multiple jurisdictions. Do you think he'll come here, to Laura's house? It's possible, Detective Osei admitted, which is why I want you and the children moved to a secure location immediately. We have a safe house arrangement we can use while this is ongoing. I'm sending a team to escort you there within the hour. Claire spent the next several minutes in a blur of motion, waking Laura and explaining the situation, gathering the children's things, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring, even as her hands shook while she packed. Ellie sensed that something serious was happening, despite her mother's efforts to hide it, tugging on Claire's sleeve with wide, worried eyes. "Mom, where's Dad? Is he okay?" Claire knelt down to her daughter's level, choosing her words as carefully as she could manage under the circumstances. "Dad has to deal with some grown-up things right now, sweetheart. We're going to go stay somewhere safe for a little while, just until everything gets sorted out. I need you to be brave for me, okay? Can you do that?" Ellie nodded slowly, though the confusion and fear in her young face broke Claire's heart, in a way she knew she would carry with her for a long time. Noah, still too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, seemed more excited about the idea of another adventure, chattering about the safe house as though it were simply another surprise trip. The escort arrived within the hour, 2 officers in an unmarked car, who helped load the family's belongings and drove them to a modest house on the outskirts of the city, arranged through a program the sheriff's department used for situations exactly like this one. Detective Osei met them there, her expression a careful mixture of professional composure and genuine concern. "We have officers watching this location around the clock," she assured Claire, walking her through the house and pointing out the security measures already in place. "You and the children are safe here. In the meantime, we have an active search underway for Daniel. We've alerted surrounding counties, put out a description of his vehicle, and we're monitoring several locations connected to his business and his known associates. What happens now?" Claire asked, sitting at the small kitchen table while the children explored the unfamiliar house with cautious curiosity. "Now we wait for a break," Detective Osei said. "It's rare for someone to evade a search like this for very long, especially once their picture and vehicle description are circulating widely. In my experience, people in his situation either try to run far and fast, hoping to disappear completely, or they make a mistake because panic clouds their judgment. Either way, we typically catch up with them within days, sometimes hours." The following 2 days passed in an agonizing blur for Claire, each hour stretching longer than the last as she waited for news, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for the children's sake, while her own mind remained consumed with fear and uncertainty. She thought constantly about Diane Coleman, about the other women whose cases Detective Osei had mentioned, wondering how many lives Daniel had destroyed over the years while presenting himself to the world as a devoted husband and loving father. On the evening of the second day, Detective Osei called with an update that made Claire's entire body go cold, with relief and dread combined. "We found him," the detective said. "A gas station clerk near the state line recognized his vehicle from the alert we put out. Local police responded, and there was a brief pursuit, but he's now in custody. He's being transported back here for processing as we speak." Claire's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she had to sit down at the kitchen table, gripping the edge for support as the reality of the moment settled over her. It was over, at least the immediate danger of it. Daniel could no longer threaten her or the children, could no longer walk freely through the world while carrying whatever darkness had lived hidden beneath his calm exterior for years. But as the relief washed over her, it brought with it an entirely new wave of grief, one she had not fully anticipated. The man she had loved for 9 years, the father of her children, the person she had built an entire life around, was gone now, in every sense that mattered, replaced by a stranger in police custody, whose true nature she was still struggling to comprehend. What happens next? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He'll be formally charged, Detective Osei explained. Given what we found at the property and at the quarry, along with evidence connecting him to the other cases, the district attorney's office is confident in moving forward with serious charges. This process will take time, Claire. Investigations like this often do, especially when there are multiple cases involved. I won't pretend the road ahead is going to be easy, but you and your children are safe now, and that's the most important thing. Claire thanked the detective and hung up the phone, then sat alone in the quiet kitchen for a long time, listening to the sound of Ellie and Noah playing in the next room, their laughter both a comfort and a painful reminder of everything that had been lost. She thought about how she would eventually need to explain all of this to her children, in whatever way was appropriate for their ages, how she would need to help them understand why their father would not be coming home, why their entire world had changed so suddenly and so completely. She thought, too, about Diane Coleman's family, about the other families whose loved ones had vanished without explanation over the years, and felt a fierce, protective resolve settle over her grief. Whatever came next, whatever difficult months lay ahead as the investigation and eventual trial unfolded, she was determined to see it through, to help ensure that the truth came fully into the light, and that no other family would ever have to endure what hers had. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Claire called Laura and told her everything, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to cry without holding anything back, grieving not just for the marriage she had lost, but for the version of herself who had once believed, completely and without doubt, that she knew the man she shared her life with. News of Daniel's arrest spread through their small town faster than Claire could have imagined, and within a day, reporters had begun gathering outside her house, hoping for a statement, a photograph, anything that might help them tell the story that was quickly becoming the biggest event their community had seen in years. Detective Osei had warned her this might happen, and had arranged for Claire and the children to remain at the safe house indefinitely, away from the growing chaos that had descended on their previously quiet neighborhood. Still, Claire could not entirely escape the story. She watched, against her better judgment, as local news channels ran segments about the respected local contractor who had been arrested in connection with the disappearance of Diane Coleman. Footage of Daniel's booking photo appearing again and again on her screen, his familiar face now looking somehow different to her, harder, colder, as though the mask he had worn for years had finally slipped away entirely once the cameras started rolling. Detective Osei visited her at the safe house a few days later with an update on the investigation, sitting across from Claire at the small kitchen table with a folder of documents she handled carefully, clearly choosing what information to share and what to hold back for now. The forensic team has been working the quarry site since the search warrant was executed, the detective said. I won't go into all the details, but I can tell you that what we've found there is consistent with what you discovered when you went out there yourself. We've also been able to connect Daniel to 2 additional cases we'd been investigating separately, cases that had never been publicly linked before now. Claire felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the kitchen. How long has this been happening? How many years? We're still building the full timeline, Detective Osei said carefully. But based on what we've found so far, it appears this pattern goes back at least 6 years, possibly longer. I want to be honest with you, Claire, because I think you deserve honesty, after everything you've done to help this investigation move forward. This is going to be a long process. There will be a trial, and it's likely to attract significant media attention, given the number of cases involved. Claire absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the timeline with her own memories of their marriage. 6 years ago, Ellie had just been born, and Claire remembered those early months of motherhood as some of the happiest of her life, full of exhaustion and joy in equal measure, with Daniel doting on their newborn daughter every evening when he came home from work. She had never once suspected, during those tender early years of parenthood, that her husband might have been living an entirely separate life beneath the surface of the one she thought she knew. Did he ever hurt me? Claire asked quietly, a question that had been circling in her mind for days, but that she had been afraid to voice aloud. Was I ever in danger, all those years, without knowing it? Detective Osei considered the question carefully before answering. Based on everything we've gathered so far, it appears his pattern targeted women outside his immediate family, women he had little to no personal relationship with beforehand. That doesn't mean you weren't in danger, Claire. Living with someone capable of this kind of violence carries its own risks, risks that are impossible to fully calculate. But I don't want you carrying guilt over years you spent simply trying to be a good wife and mother, unaware of something you had no reasonable way of detecting. The words offered some small measure of comfort, though Claire knew it would take much longer than a single conversation to fully process everything she had learned over the past several weeks. She spent her days at the safe house, trying to create some sense of stability for Ellie and Noah, helping them with schoolwork sent over by their teachers, taking them on short walks in the fenced backyard, trying to shield them as much as possible from the growing media storm surrounding their father's arrest. Ellie, old enough to sense that something serious was happening, even without fully understanding the details, had begun asking more pointed questions, and Claire found herself navigating conversations she had never imagined having with an 8-year-old, trying to find words simple enough for her daughter to understand, without being so vague that Ellie was left more confused and frightened than before. "Your father did some very bad things," Claire told her one evening, sitting together on the small bed in Ellie's temporary room. "Things that mean he can't be a part of our daily lives anymore. I know that's hard to understand, and I know you must have a lot of feelings about it, and that's okay. You can feel however you need to feel." "Did he stop loving us?" Ellie asked, her voice small and uncertain. Claire pulled her daughter close, fighting back her own tears so she could remain steady for Ellie's sake. "I don't think this was ever about love or not loving us, sweetheart. I think your father had something broken inside him that made him do terrible things to other people. Things that had nothing to do with you or Noah or me. That doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean we have to forgive him or pretend everything is fine. But I don't want you to carry the weight of wondering if you did something wrong, because you didn't. None of this is your fault." These conversations left Claire emotionally drained, in ways she had never experienced before, but she found a strange kind of strength in them as well, a determination to help her children process this trauma as honestly and gently as possible, even as she was still working through her own grief and anger and confusion. Laura remained a constant support throughout this period, visiting the safe house whenever she could, helping Claire manage the practical realities of the situation, from finding a lawyer to help navigate the legal complexities of their marriage and finances, to fielding calls from reporters who somehow kept finding ways to reach Claire's phone, despite her best efforts to keep her new number private. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Daniel's arrest, Claire received a letter, forwarded from her old address, handwritten, and addressed to her directly. She recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately, and her hands shook as she held the envelope, unsure whether she had the strength to open it. She sat with the unopened letter for 2 full days, before finally deciding to read it, curled up alone in the safe house's small living room after the children had gone to sleep, bracing herself for whatever words her husband, now facing serious criminal charges, might have chosen to send her. The letter was shorter than she expected, and far colder than she had anticipated. Daniel did not apologize, did not express remorse for what he had done, or acknowledge the pain he had caused. Instead, the letter read almost like a business communication, discussing practical matters, asking about the children, requesting that Claire visit him so they could discuss things further. Claire read the letter 3 times, searching for some trace of the man she had once loved, some evidence that beneath the crimes he had committed, there remained a shred of the warmth and tenderness she remembered from their early years together. She found none of it. Whatever gentleness she had once believed defined her husband's character, now seemed, in the cold light of this letter, to have been nothing more than a carefully constructed performance, one he had maintained flawlessly for nearly a decade. She did not respond to the letter. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, deciding that whatever conversations needed to happen between them going forward would happen through lawyers and legal proceedings, not through private correspondence that only reopened wounds she was trying desperately to heal. That night, she called Detective Osei to inform her about the letter, and the detective thanked her for reporting it, noting that it might be relevant to the ongoing investigation, and asking Claire to preserve it as evidence rather than disposing of it. Claire agreed, understanding now, more clearly than ever, that her own life had become permanently entangled with the machinery of a criminal investigation that would likely continue for months, possibly years, before any real resolution arrived. The months that followed brought a slow, grinding process of legal proceedings that tested Claire's patience and emotional endurance in ways she had never experienced before. The district attorney's office, led by a prosecutor named Patricia Grant, met with Claire several times to prepare for what promised to be a lengthy and highly publicized trial. Patricia was thorough and direct, walking Claire through what to expect at each stage of the process, from preliminary hearings to jury selection to the trial itself. "Your testimony is going to be important," Patricia explained during one of their early meetings, sitting across from Claire in a small conference room at the courthouse. "You were the one who discovered the evidence that broke this case open. The defense is going to try to challenge your credibility, to suggest that you're a bitter spouse looking for revenge or attention. We need to prepare you for that." Claire nodded, absorbing the weight of what lay ahead. She had never imagined, in all her years as a schoolteacher and mother, that she would one day find herself preparing to testify in a criminal trial involving her own husband. The strangeness of it still sometimes overwhelmed her in quiet moments, when she would catch herself thinking about Daniel not as the man she had married, but as a defendant, a suspect, a person the state was working to hold accountable for crimes almost too horrible to fully comprehend. During this period, Claire also found herself contacted by families of the other victims connected to the case, women whose daughters, sisters, and mothers had disappeared over the years without explanation, their cases growing cold until Claire's discovery had finally provided the break investigators needed. The first contact came from Diane Coleman's mother, an older woman named Vivian Coleman, who reached out through Detective Osei, asking if Claire would be willing to meet with her. Claire agreed, though she felt a deep uncertainty about what such a meeting might involve, unsure whether Vivian would view her with gratitude for helping uncover the truth, or with resentment for having been married to the man responsible for her daughter's disappearance in the first place. They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from the media attention that still occasionally followed Claire whenever she ventured out in public. Vivian was a small, dignified woman, with tired eyes, that carried the unmistakable weight of grief that had not yet found any resolution. She reached across the table and took Claire's hand the moment they sat down together, and Claire felt tears forming instantly at the unexpected gentleness of the gesture. "I don't blame you," Vivian said quietly, before Claire could even find the words to explain herself. "I want you to know that. What you did, going into that garage, following your instincts even when it must have been terrifying, that took more courage than most people could ever find. Because of you, we finally know what happened to Diane. Because of you, other families might be spared the same uncertainty we lived with for 8 months." Claire found it difficult to speak past the lump in her throat, but she managed to express her own sorrow, her own guilt over having shared a life for years with the man responsible for so much pain, without ever suspecting the truth hiding beneath their ordinary domestic life. Vivian listened patiently, nodding with understanding rather than judgment, and by the end of their meeting, something had shifted between them, a fragile but real connection forged out of shared tragedy. Over the following weeks, Claire met with 2 other families as well, each conversation difficult in its own way, each one adding another layer to her understanding of the full scope of what Daniel had done over the years of their marriage. She learned that the investigation had eventually connected him to 4 separate cases spanning nearly 7 years, each victim a woman he had encountered through his contracting business, or through chance interactions in towns where he traveled for work. Each disappearance carefully planned to avoid drawing attention or suspicion back to himself. The revelations were almost too much for Claire to process at times, and she found herself relying heavily on a therapist that Laura had helped her find, a calm and experienced woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in helping people process trauma related to discovering hidden violence within their own families. Their sessions became a vital anchor point in Claire's week, a space where she could voice the anger, grief, guilt, and confusion that continued to surface unpredictably as the investigation and legal proceedings dragged on. "You're allowed to grieve the marriage you thought you had," Dr. Patel told her during one particularly difficult session, even while also being angry at the reality of what it actually was. "Those 2 feelings can exist together. It doesn't make you weak, and it doesn't mean you're excusing what he did." Claire held on to those words during the difficult months that followed, using them as a kind of anchor whenever the grief threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She continued working with Patricia Grant to prepare her testimony, reviewing the timeline of events again and again until every detail was clear and consistent in her mind. knowing that the defense attorney would look for any inconsistency to use against her credibility once she took the stand. The children, meanwhile, continued their own difficult adjustment to their new reality. Claire had enrolled them in a new school in a different district, hoping to give them some distance from the intense media attention that continued to surround their family name back in their old town. Ellie struggled the most, her once cheerful and confident personality giving way to periods of withdrawal and anxiety that worried Claire deeply, prompting her to arrange for Ellie to begin seeing a child therapist who specialized in helping young people process complicated family trauma. Noah, still young enough to process things somewhat differently, asked fewer direct questions about his father, but began exhibiting other signs of stress, nightmares that woke him several nights a week, a new clinginess that had not been part of his personality before. Claire did her best to provide stability and reassurance for both children, even as her own emotional reserves felt stretched thinner with each passing week. Through it all, she leaned heavily on Laura, on Dr. Patel, on the small circle of trusted friends who had remained loyal to her despite the overwhelming publicity surrounding the case. Olivia, her closest friend from their old neighborhood, visited often, bringing homemade meals and offering quiet companionship on the evenings when Claire felt too exhausted to do much more than sit on the couch and try to breathe through the weight of everything happening around her. As the trial date approached, drawing closer with each passing week, Claire found herself preparing not just for the legal proceedings ahead, but for the reality of seeing Daniel again, in person for the first time since the morning she had delivered his tool bag to the job site, unaware at the time that it would be the last ordinary moment she would ever share with the man she had once believed was her husband in every sense that mattered. The trial began on a cold morning, nearly a year after Claire had first walked into that garage and found her husband standing over a sink filled with pink water. The courthouse was surrounded by media vans and reporters from outlets far beyond their small local news stations, the case having grown into a story that captured attention across the entire region and, eventually, well beyond it. Claire arrived each day through a side entrance arranged by Detective Osei, trying to avoid the crowd of cameras waiting at the main doors, though she could never entirely escape the flashing lights and shouted questions that followed her whenever she was spotted. Seeing Daniel again for the first time, sitting at the defense table in a plain suit, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through Claire that she had not fully anticipated despite months of preparation. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, though she knew that was likely just her own perception shifting now that she understood the darkness that had always existed beneath his calm and confident exterior. He looked at her only once, during a recess on the second day, their eyes meeting briefly across the courtroom, before Claire quickly looked away, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of holding her gaze, unwilling to let him see how much the sight of him still affected her, despite everything she now knew about who he truly was. Patricia Grant built a methodical case over the following days, presenting evidence gathered from the quarry, from the wooden box discovered in the locked cabinet, from digital records showing Daniel's movements on the nights each victim had disappeared. Forensic experts testified about evidence recovered from the quarry site, their careful, clinical language somehow making the horror of what had happened there feel both more real and more distant at the same time. Claire took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, her legs unsteady as she walked to the witness box, her eyes finding Laura's supportive face in the gallery, before she sat down and prepared to answer Patricia's questions. She spoke about the night in the garage, about the receipt from Millbrook, about the growing unease that had led her to search the locked cabinet and eventually discover the wooden box hidden inside it. She described her visit to the quarry, her voice steady, despite the memory still sending chills through her body, even months later. The defense attorney, a sharp and experienced lawyer named Gerald Whitmore, cross-examined her with exactly the kind of pointed skepticism Patricia had warned her to expect, suggesting that Claire's discovery of the evidence was suspiciously convenient, questioning why she had not gone to the police immediately, rather than conducting her own investigation first, implying that her actions suggested a motive beyond simple concern for justice. Claire answered each question as honestly and calmly as she could manage, explaining her fear of accusing her husband without sufficient proof, her desire to understand the full truth before potentially destroying her family's life, based on suspicion alone. She could feel the jury watching her closely throughout this exchange, and she hoped, desperately, that they could see the truth in her words, that they understood the impossible position she had found herself in nearly a year earlier. The trial continued for nearly 3 weeks, with a parade of witnesses, including forensic specialists, colleagues from Daniel's contracting business, who testified about his sometimes unexplained absences, and even Grace Bennett, who nervously but firmly described what she had witnessed the night she saw Daniel driving away from the neighborhood without his headlights on. Vivian Coleman testified as well, her composed grief adding a devastating human weight to the technical evidence that had already been presented. Daniel did not testify in his own defense, a decision that Patricia later explained was likely a strategic choice by his legal team, unwilling to risk exposing him to cross-examination that might reveal inconsistencies or reactions that could further damage his case in the eyes of the jury. Claire watched him throughout the trial, studying his face for any sign of remorse, any flicker of the man she had once loved, and found nothing but careful, practiced composure that never once cracked, even as witness after witness described the horror of what had been found at the quarry. The jury deliberated for 2 full days before returning with their verdict, days that Claire spent pacing the halls of the courthouse with Laura by her side, unable to focus on anything else, her stomach twisted into knots of anxious anticipation. When the jury foreman finally stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that Claire could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Guilty, on every count. The word washed over Claire in a wave of relief, so powerful it left her nearly breathless, tears streaming down her face, as Laura wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her steady through the overwhelming rush of emotion. Across the courtroom, she saw Vivian Coleman lower her head, her own tears finally falling freely after months of maintaining a careful composure throughout the difficult proceedings. Daniel showed no visible reaction to the verdict, his expression remaining as carefully controlled as it had been throughout the entire trial, though Claire noticed his hands tightening briefly around the edge of the defense table before he was led away by the courtroom officers, his future now entirely out of his own hands, determined instead by the sentencing hearing that would follow in the coming weeks. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed toward Claire as she made her way to Laura's car, shouting questions about her reaction to the verdict, about her plans for the future, about how her children were coping with everything that had happened. She did not stop to answer any of them, keeping her head down and her arm linked through her sister's as they pushed through the crowd toward the safety of the parking garage. Once inside the car, doors locked and the noise of the crowd finally muffled by the closed windows, Claire allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing into her hands as nearly a year of accumulated fear, grief, and exhaustion finally found its release. Laura sat beside her quietly, offering no words, simply providing the steady, patient presence that had carried Claire through every difficult moment since that first terrifying phone call nearly a year earlier. "It's over," Laura finally said softly, once Claire's sobs had begun to quiet. "You did it. You survived this, and you made sure the truth came out. Whatever comes next, you don't have to carry the weight of not knowing anymore." Claire nodded, wiping her eyes and taking a slow, deep breath, feeling something inside her chest loosen for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The trial was over. The truth had finally been fully revealed, not just to her, but to the entire community, to the families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Whatever grief and healing still lay ahead of her, she understood now that she had done everything within her power to ensure that justice, however painful and hard-won, had finally been served. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks after the verdict, and this time Claire chose to attend without hesitation, sitting beside Laura and Olivia in the front row of the gallery, determined to see the process through to its conclusion. Vivian Coleman and the other victims' family members were present as well, and before the judge announced the sentence, several of them were given the opportunity to speak, describing in raw, unguarded terms the devastating impact Daniel's actions had inflicted on their lives. Claire chose to speak as well, standing at a small podium facing the judge, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt in her hands. She did not speak about anger or revenge. Instead, she spoke about her children, about the difficult conversations she had needed to have with them, about the years of trust that had been shattered the moment she discovered the truth hiding behind her husband's carefully maintained facade. She spoke about the courage it had taken to walk into that garage and keep asking questions, even when every instinct told her it might be safer to look away. The judge listened carefully to each statement before delivering the sentence, a lengthy prison term that would ensure Daniel would not walk free again for the rest of his natural life. Claire felt no triumph in the moment, no sense of victory that could undo the damage already done, but she did feel something closer to closure, a recognition that the legal system had done what it could to hold him accountable for the pain he had caused so many families, including her own. In the months that followed the sentencing, Claire began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding a life for herself and her children, one that looked nothing like the future she had once imagined for them. She and the children eventually settled into a small house in a new town, far enough from their old neighborhood to escape the constant reminders and lingering media attention, close enough to Laura that her sister remained a steady presence in their daily lives. Claire returned to teaching, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar rhythms of the classroom, in the simple, uncomplicated trust of young students who knew nothing of her past and asked nothing more of her than patience and guidance with their reading lessons. The work gave her a sense of purpose during a period when so much of her identity had been thrown into question, a reminder that she was still capable of building something good, even after everything that had been taken from her. Ellie's healing came slowly, marked by setbacks as much as progress, but with the continued support of her therapist and the stability of their new routine, she gradually began to reclaim some of the joy and confidence that had once defined her personality. She took up violin again after a long period of refusing to touch the instrument, and the first time Claire heard her daughter play again, filling their small new home with music, she had to step into the next room to hide the tears that came unexpectedly and would not stop. Noah adjusted more quickly than his sister, though Claire remained watchful for signs of the trauma resurfacing as he grew older and gained a fuller understanding of what had happened to his father. She made a point of keeping the lines of communication open with both children, never shying away from their questions, always answering as honestly as she could manage, while remaining mindful of what was appropriate for their ages. Claire continued seeing Dr. Patel regularly, working through the complicated layers of grief, betrayal, and self-doubt that continued to surface, even years after the trial had concluded. She grappled for a long time with the question of how she could have shared nearly a decade of her life with a man capable of such violence without ever suspecting the truth, and Dr. Patel helped her understand, gradually, that the fault for that deception belonged entirely to Daniel, who had spent years carefully constructing a false version of himself, specifically designed to avoid detection. People who do what he did are often remarkably skilled at hiding it, Dr. Patel explained during one of their sessions. That's not a reflection of any failure on your part. It's a reflection of how carefully he worked to deceive everyone around him, including the person closest to him. You didn't miss obvious signs because you weren't paying attention. You missed them because he made sure they were nearly impossible to see. These words helped Claire slowly release some of the guilt she had carried since the beginning, though she understood that fully healing from an experience like this would likely take years, perhaps the rest of her life, and that some scars might never fully disappear. She found, however, that she was learning to carry them differently, not as evidence of her own failure, but as proof of the strength it had taken to face an unbearable truth and act on it, despite her fear. She reconnected with Grace Bennett occasionally, the older woman having become something of an unlikely ally throughout the entire ordeal, and the two women often spoke on the phone, Grace checking in with the same gentle concern she had shown from the very beginning. Claire also remained in contact with Vivian Coleman, the two women bound together by a shared tragedy that had, against all odds, grown into a genuine friendship built on mutual understanding and support. On the second anniversary of Daniel's arrest, Claire sat on the back porch of her new home, watching Ellie and Noah play in the yard as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. She thought back to that terrifying night when she had woken to find the other side of the bed empty, to the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her in the weeks that followed, to the courage it had taken to keep asking questions, even when the answers threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. She had lost so much in those difficult months, a marriage she had believed was built on love and trust, a sense of safety she had once taken entirely for granted, a version of herself who had never needed to question the fundamental goodness of the person she shared her bed with each night. But she had also discovered something else along the way, a resilience she had never known she possessed, a strength that had carried her and her children through the darkest period of their lives and out the other side, into something that, however different from what she had once imagined, still held genuine hope for the future. Ellie looked up from the yard and waved at her mother, a wide, unguarded smile spreading across her face, and Claire waved back, feeling something settle quietly into place inside her chest, a fragile but real sense of peace that she had not believed, during those darkest early weeks, she would ever feel again. Whatever had been broken in their lives by Daniel's betrayal, she understood now that it was possible to build something new from the pieces that remained, something honest and whole, even after everything they had survived together. The sun continued its slow descent behind the trees, and Claire remained on the porch a while longer, watching her children play, grateful, in a way she never could have anticipated a few years earlier, simply for the quiet, ordinary safety of this single peaceful evening.